So I'd like to introduce Nigel Francis from the University of Cardiff, and he's going to be presenting about process-based assessment.
Thanks, Kate. So thanks very much for the opportunity to present today. Hat tip to Professor David Smith here as well from Sheffield Hallam. So a lot of the work that's gone into this process versus product assessment really has been done in collaboration with him. What I think really I wanted to try and get across is that when we are talking about competency-based assessment, quite often we might be assessing the wrong things. And we look very much at the output and the final product that the students produce rather than potentially the process that they've gone through to get to that. So what I wanted to do is really start with a bit of a provocation. So which of these two students essentially has met the competencies and the learning outcomes of their piece of work? So you've got one that's basically just cut and pasted an answer to another one that's gone through that experiential learning journey of skill development. And so which of these two students is really demonstrating competency? And I think, obviously, the slightly flippant answer is, well, it depends on what you're assessing. If you're assessing a student's ability to control C, control V, then clearly student one has met the competencies. But in virtually all of the types of assessments that we're going to be doing, that student that's gone through that learning journey and has failed and has improved and reflected, and we've heard a lot about that this afternoon, that's the student that's going to ultimately be able to demonstrate competency. Mm-hmm. So when we think about sort of process versus product, I think it's really important that we actually define what we're talking about in this. And to try and illustrate that, I want you to do sort of a bit of a reflective exercise for yourselves. If I asked you to list the title of the second essay in the second module in your second year at university that you wrote, how many of you genuinely would actually be able to do that? Because I know I can't. I couldn't even remember what the second module title would be in my second year at university. But if you asked me to sit down in a room and you gave me access to all the resources that I would need, and you said, can you write an essay now? Then the answer would be yes, I've gone through, I know how to do that. So really, when we're talking about this process versus product, what we're talking about is that process of how learning and assessment happens. So what the student does in order to be able to get to that final product. And that product is that final output and the result of that student work. And arguably, I'd say it's the process that is much more important. And certainly when we're talking about competency-based assessment, it's that focus on the skill and the demonstration of that skill, not purely the outcome that we need to be thinking about and we need to be assessing. So some of the problems when we're sort of thinking about product-focused assessment, and this really came about because of Gen AI and the challenges that poses for us. But traditionally, most universities, and preaching to the converted here, obviously with this conference, but we reward the output, and we don't really focus on the growth and the understanding, the application of knowledge as much as we do that final polished output. I think some of the consequences of that is that it encourages students to become very mark-focused, product-focused. So that encourages surface learning. What do I need to do just to get the best mark possible? It means that if we're looking at really their authentic competency and whether or not they can actually carry out a skill, then that gets obscured a little bit by focusing on that shiny end product. And certainly with the sort of like the advent of AI, that really starts to increase the risk of academic misconduct. We've always had a small minority of students that would use essay mills or contract cheating sites. What AI has done is just made that much more accessible and much cheaper for those minority of students that do want to cheat. And certainly with an output which can be AI'd, and I'll talk a bit about the precise context that we applied this in a minute, then it becomes very sort of distracting to the overall progression of that student and growth of that student if they can AI a lot of these outputs. Get the slides to move forward. There we go. So really, for me, I think competency is more about what a student is able to do over time, whether they can repeat a skill. It's not just about what's done once. And when we talk about a product, we are really just assessing that one output. And that goes back to what I was saying about that second year essay that you may have written in that second module. You've done it once and you can't remember it and you've discarded it. But that process of learning how to find the information to write an essay, those are the skills that are stuck with people. So some of the examples of process evidence in assessment we've heard most of these already this afternoon. But talking about drafts and iterations, how do you improve something based on the feedback? So engagement with feedback and reflecting on that, whether that feedback comes from peer interactions, so you do sort of like a near peer or peer-peer feedback sessions, whether that is engagement with feedback from staff, whether it is writing reflective commentaries as a part of a portfolio, or maybe planning documents and or coding books, so that you can actually start to sort of go through that process of iteration. So that's really what I'm talking about when we talk about sort of evidencing that process and recording those so that they can then be assessed. If we want to move away from assessment of learning to assessment for learning and assessment as learning, then I think we really need to start to be integrating process-orientated approaches. So things like blogs and portfolios that we heard a lot about just before the break, redesigning those marking rubrics, those marking criteria to reward reflection, to reward iteration and problem solving. And then starting to think about those feedback loops that Dom spoke about earlier in terms of reflective practice. And when it comes to the role of AI, thinking about how do we make it more transparent? So the use of logs and things like that, teaching students about how to use AI ethically so that we can actually start to incorporate the AI and use it as an ally rather than something that we need to be fighting against. So in terms of the actual specific context that we applied competency-based learning in this process versus product, in the first year at Cardiff, we had a scheme-specific essay that all of our first-year tutees would do within tutor groups. This was a take-home essay. The students would write a formative essay and then they would write a summative essay across the 2 semesters. And when AI raised its head and came on the scene, panic mode was activated within the department. Everyone started to think, oh, what am I going to do? How am I going to ensure that the assessment is robust and it's still fit for purpose? Because at that point, it wasn't. The first year of AI really showed that that was the case. A lot of the essays that were produced were very, very superficial. There was a high degree of suspicion that a lot of those essays had been produced using AI, but obviously we weren't able to prove that. So what we did was moving towards the second year was of AI, that is not second year study, sorry. But we started introducing this process versus product assessment. So we started introducing a research trail or process trail, as we call it. What we wanted the students to do was actually to really start logging how they had got to that end product, how they'd produced that essay. And because this was something that the students would never have done before, we decided that we were going to make that formative task in the first semester a group-based project. So they choose one essay title that their tutor would provide. They would go away and as a group, they would produce one research trail and one essay, and then they would submit that for feedback. They then repeated that task, but on an individual basis for the summative essay. So the idea with the formative one was to give them that experience and also to have that support network around them so that they weren't sort of just thrown in at the deep end. And then to repeat that with that summative essay on an individual basis. What we did in order to try and make sure that the students engaged with it was to more heavily weight that process trail. So we awarded 65% of the marks for that process and then 35% for the essay. I actually argued quite heavily that we should be rewarding the process even more. I asked for about 75%, but unfortunately there were some members of staff that were a little bit reluctant to do that. But what we are trying to emphasize to the students is that the process is the most important part of this assessment, and that's what we're weighting the most heavily for, and that's what we want to see the evidence of. That process trail, we divided up really into 2 parts. The first part was around the search strategy. So what kind of sources did you use? How did you assess the value and the usefulness of them? What keywords were used when you did search strings, or if you engaged with AI, what prompts did you use? And we asked students to document that. And then the second part was really about the critical evaluation. So we asked students to justify why they had chosen certain sources to include in the essay, and then also some that they had rejected as well. And so what that looks like in terms of the pro forma that we produced for them was really trying to standardize this to make it as easy for the students to complete as possible, to make it really clear exactly what information we wanted for them. So you can see here the production log, the first question is around that search strategy. So we asked them about what types of sources they were using, whether that was textbooks, whether it was encyclopedias, papers, and to really just briefly comment on why they found those sources valuable. So very often you'd get students that would say, well, I first looked at Wikipedia because I didn't really know much about this topic, gave me a really good background, and then I started going down into sort of like papers and textbooks, and they would critique the benefit of that. We also give them training through the library service about how to construct search strings and sort of like to do literature searching. We give them some training on how to use AI. And so we asked them to tabulate what they did there. So how did they actually start refining that search? If they say put in COVID as their first search term and they got a couple of million papers back, how did they narrow that down so that they got something which was useful and so that it could be applied to the work? We then asked them about sort of illustrating that process. So essentially, how would they construct a search string? So, for example, if they were combining search strings together, if they were prompting iteratively with an AI tool, then so we asked them to record all of that. The second part was really around about the justification and the evaluation of those sources. So we asked them to pick two sources that they had included, and they had to be different sources. So one, for example, could be a website, one could be a peer-reviewed paper. And we really asked them to critique and to evidence why they had chosen to include those papers. And then we did the same thing with one paper that they had not included. So we were trying to get them to really think about the process that they go through in order to decide whether or not they are including those sources within their work. So did it work? Was it a success or failure? I think there were some positives. There were some challenges as well. The first one was staff buy-in, and I think that's common whenever you're trying to try something new, something innovative. Some staff were quite resistant to the change. They didn't see the point of it. And those were the same staff who subsequently were complaining that a lot of the essays were written by AI. And trying to sort of educate those people that this process isn't about trying to catch people. It's about trying to make it transparent and trying to make them more aware of the process they go through. We had a similar challenge with the students. Some of them were questioning why we were assessing that process, what the point of it was when they were producing an essay. Again, there's that process of education there in terms of trying to teach the students about why this is important. Why do they need to be able to evidence these skills and how it's going to benefit them in the future? Despite the fact that we weighted the process trail so heavily at 65%, some of the students failed to submit it, so ultimately ended up failing the assessment, which is unfortunate. But I think one of the things that we were quite happy with was that it was noted by at least two of the external examiners as good practice. And so I'm not saying it's perfect. There are definitely refinements that need to be made by the team in Cardiff moving forward into next year in order to try and make it a little bit more streamlined and a little bit more focused on evidencing that process. But really, for me, the closing thoughts on this are that the product still matters, but not at the expense of an invisible process. I think we really need to be looking at that process. So the questions are, is how do we really design for reward and competency and that development of competency? And how do we place value on that really messy process that the students go through that we call learning rather than just a polished output that they produce at the end? So if our goal is really to develop those students and those graduates are competent and could go out and be practitioners in their field, for me, I think that we should be assessing not just what they do, but how they get there and the process that they go through in order to reach that point. So thank you very much. I hope that's answered some of the questions about sort of the process versus product approach. I'm more than happy to take any questions if we've got time.
Thanks very much. That was really helpful. Are there any questions? Yes, somebody's put their hand up. Oh, no, they haven't. They tricked me. Any questions from anybody? Andrew, is there anything in the chat?
There's nothing in particular in the chat. People asking for examples. And what really struck me was it really resonated with me that Nigel, that we spend so much time focusing on assessing the product, and students spend all their time focusing on the end product, when really it's about the process. And so how do we actually start to totally shift assessment to focusing on process rather than product? And yet we have this, I think this is the phrase that formative and summative assessment are kind of entangled together, and really they need separating out. And the whole grading system is based on that end product, when really it's the process that is more important. So that really interesting that I found. Yes. Sorry, we've got a hand up here from Anna, I think.
Yeah, just a quick question. Yep, sorry. Do any of your students spend too much time on this? You know, sort of, do you set any limits on, particularly because I can see, I don't know, them both wanting to do really well, so then ending up adding lots of time on the process in addition to needing to put together the assessment.
I think the two go hand in hand, and what we saw is certainly those students that produced a more detailed process trail had far better essays because they'd engaged with that process much more. And so the more that the students are willing to engage with that, the easier it is for them to ultimately write that essay. They've done the background reading, they've done the preparatory work, and so the actual writing process itself is quite quick. We did cut down the length of the essay. So previously it was a 2,500 word piece, and we cut that down to make it a bit more streamlined, so to acknowledge the fact that they do have that process log as well. But they do get about 6 weeks to do this. So it's not as if it's a really time limited assessment either. They've got plenty of time for them to engage with this as a process. But yeah, there's definitely a correlation there between the amount of effort they put into the process and the actual end product and the mark they get for that.
Thanks very much. Okay,